Hello and welcome to chapter 9, where we're going to finally set up the whitewater simulation. Now, if you were going to use default Houdini nodes, then you would use the whitewater solver that exists inside DOPS. Problem with that is it's not going to give us very good controls for large water interaction with the air, and even though it has some nice foam controls, we don't really need that for our shot, so it's not going to be the best choice. What we're going to do instead is create our own solver from scratch. And for that, the first thing that we need to do is put down a pop network. We're going to plug the source into this pop network and dive inside. Now, first thing, I'll get rid of this merge. And in the source, I will hide the guides. I will set the emission type to all points from the first input, and on the birth tab I will set the jitter birth time to none, since we're already kind of extending backwards the source with the point replicate, so we don't really need to do that anymore. Now if we hit play, we'll get points being sourced from our emission points. So now what we want to do, first thing we want to do is add some gravity, put down a pop force, and set the force to minus 9.8, just to be proper consistent. And we can also kill all the points that fall below a certain height, because we're not going to see any of them. Oops. So putting down a pop kill and set the expression to something like if position Y is less than, let's say, minus 3.5 meters, then kill the particles. Now if we hit play, we see that these are getting removed somewhere down there, which should be enough for our case. And great. Next thing we want to do is set up a maximum life for these whitewater particles to exist. Instead of setting the values here in the source, we're going to set some per point values outside, adding value to the life attribute. Put down a attribute wrangle, call it set life, and here we can write an expression. We're going to make it depend on the emission attribute that we had in the incoming source points. So life is going to be equal to the result of fitting the emission, which goes from 0 to 1, to, let's say, when the emission is very low, they can live for 2 seconds, and when it's high, they can live up to 6 seconds. And we're going to also randomize this a little bit by multiplying by some random value per point. To this, we can add probably the time, just to get some random seed for every frame. And since this rand goes from 0 to 1, again, we can use the fit01 function and just add some values that make the life slightly lower or slightly higher. So let's say 0.8 to 1.2. Yeah, perfect. So with that set, we can go back down to the popnet. Let's play some frames and look at what we want to achieve. And what we want is really to have some sort of interaction between these particles. Something that tells the neighboring particles that they should get some average velocity to fake what would happen in reality, which is that all of these points would be droplets interacting with each other via surface tension and collisions and whatnot. And in order to do that, first we're going to compute the density of points that we have. And we'll do that like we did with the flip simulation, using a subsolver. Put down a subsolver, and I will call it density and velocity smoothing. Perfect. Now, inside this solver, I will do something very similar to what I did in the case of the flip sim. Put down a VDB node to create a density field with some voxel size, like scene, for example, I know it's going to work nicely. And I want to rasterize the incoming points. So before I rasterize them, let me delete all the attributes that I don't want, which is basically all of them except the velocity, which is going to come in handy in a second. And I will now put down a volume rasterize particles. Keep the VDB on the first input and the points on the second. Now the particle scale, I want it to correlate to the voxel size. Paste relative references, and I'll set the filter to box. Now I should have here a density VDB that contains essentially the number of points in each cell, and I can pass that on to the mesh, the points using wrangle, and say that a new PT density attribute will be equal to volume sampling from the first input, the only grid we have, at the point position. Great. Now, same thing as we did with the case of the flip sim, I'm going to collapse this into a compiled block, just because it'll run a bit faster. So I can put the inputs like this, and outside I will hit the input compile block. The input that it expects is data, so I'll go into the begin block and write data. Oops, not date. Data. Perfect. So now we should get a PT density attribute being created. Here it is. And we can visualize it. So we can put down a pop color, for example, set it to be a ramp, and in the ramp value, just write PT density. Great. And now if we play with the values here, we can see that we can remap it to target some of the high density areas as white, low density areas will appear as black. I can change that actually. I'll make it some sort of blue color to look a bit more watery. Something like this. And now we have a density. But what do we do with it? Okay, so first of all, let's do the actual velocity smoothing I was talking about. I'm going to do something similar to what the flip solver actually does, which is rasterize all the velocities of the points to a grid and then back down to the particles. So I'm going to copy paste these two nodes here, and this VDB is going to be called V for velocity, and it's going to be V. It's going to be a vector float, and as the voxel size, I'm going to copy the value of the density voxel size, but I make it a little bit smaller, just because I know it's going to be good that the radius of the smoothing is a little bit smaller than what we use to compute the density. So just a little factor here. Perfect. Now, in the rasterized particles, I see that this is linked properly, and we should be getting a V field exactly, which we can plug into the wrangle here, and essentially tell the particles that their velocity vector should now, instead of the normal velocity, be the result of volume sampling the V vector field from the third input at the point position. Now let's see what this actually does. We press play. Now we can see that the particles are clinging together a lot more. Essentially, this is the result of just smoothing the velocity by some sort of radius. And the reason why it looks a bit more watery, a bit more tenderly, is because, well, this is also what the flip sim is doing. And this is great for us because we can get a whitewater sim that looks a bit like a super high-res flip sim, but at a much cheaper price. Now, to adjust this a bit better, I don't want to make the whole of the rasterized velocity become the point velocity. So I can use a lerp function to mix only a portion of it. And I can do mix my original velocity and the new velocity by a factor. Let's say 0.5. If we take a look at this now, it'll look a bit different. yeah, not so much clinging together, but still a bit, which is good. But instead of a constant value, I'll make this so that it depends on the age of the particles, so that when they get born, they cling together to each other a lot more, and as they age, that kind of disappears. So let me define a ratio float. It's going to be the result of fitting the age, say from half a second up to 5 seconds, and at the beginning we'll have the 0.5 ratio that we had now, and as they age it'll go back down to 0.1, not quite 0. And now we can just put the ratio here. Great. So we should see the effect of that now. It'd be hard to see unless we were to play the whole simulation and let the particles age up to 5 seconds. But we should be getting that behavior now. Now, for the density itself, I'm going to do something where I taper off the high values using a square root. So I'm going to write in the PT density a pow function and set the exponent to 0.5. And this should give me, yeah, a bit of a different look where the super high density values that we had now won't get quite as high density. And I think this will look a bit better. Great. So that looks quite a bit like water, I would say. Much more than our default ballistic particles. What we're missing, though, is different air resistance based on density, which is going to be key to sell the fact that this is very large scale. Now, to do this, now that we have this PT density, we can put down a pop advect by volumes node and finally get to use the air field that we simulated. So go back up when I plug into the second input of the popnet, the result of our air field. And that's just going to be a velocity volume, which we can give into this node and tell it to use the first context geometry. We can set it to update force, and that's all good. But the air resistance, which we can lower a bit because it might be too much, instead of being uniform for all the particles across all densities, we can write an expression down here and say, for example, the air resistance is going to be scaled by the result of fitting the point density. Let's say if we're visualizing 0 to 4, let's say 0 to 3, where at the low density the air resistance will be quite high, so let's leave it at 1, and at the low density it'll be just smaller, let's say 0.2. If we press play now, we should see some sort of smearing happening where things that have high density travel further, and as soon as they're starting, and you can see it up here, they're starting to become sparse, they're going to drag more in the air with this turbulent air field. And this is what will give us those very, very nice trails that we get in large-scale water splashes. Now, to randomize this a bit more, instead of down to 0.2, I can put a rand expression here, just by ID, something like this. And something else that I can do is bias the air resistance just to be a little bit lower when the particles are just born, so that we get a decent initial velocity. So I'll put another factor here, and I'm going to use h and say that from when the particles are born up to when they're almost a second of age, so 0.8 for example, at the beginning they'll have lower resistance, just instead of 1, something lower like 0.65, like 2/3, and then up to 1 after they've aged enough. And that will give us a better initial kick. Now, what else could we tweak here to sell the fact that the particles that become low density are more like misty particles floating in the air? And something that we can do these nice trails here, is actually fake the gravity, which is not something that you should do often. But we can write an expression in the gravity parameter here and say something like force is going to be scaled by the result of fitting PT density, say from 0 to 4. So when they're lower density, the gravity will be slightly smaller, say 0.6. And when there's high density, gravity will be full-on gravity. Right, so we'll mostly see these in the falling trails after, they've had time to develop more, where the low-density particles will cling in the air for a bit longer, floating around and, affected by the turbulence field. Great. So in the next chapter, we will keep improving our pop solver. We will add some extra density interaction controls. We'll add some noise breakup and also look at collisions both with the fluid surface and with the creature as well. See you in the next chapter. Thank you.